McLaren have secured the World Constructors' Championship for the 10th time in their rich and storied history. On a humid Sunday night in Singapore, under the famous Marina Bay lights, the Woking Base team put the final seal on what had been inevitable for weeks. There are still 3 sprint races and 6 GP races left on the calendar, yet the celebrations have already begun. To anyone who has followed this season closely, it is not a surprise, but the formal confirmation still carried weight. Watching papaya-clad mechanics and engineers embracing one another in the garage felt like a reminder of just how far this team has come since their darkest days. The moment was more than just another title secured. It was the culmination of years of patience, tough decisions, cultural shifts, and relentless pursuit of progress. If we wind the clock back to March, when the season began with the Australian GP at Albert Park, very few people would have predicted McLaren would deliver a campaign of such dominance. The early paddock talk, whispered in the damp air of a rainy Melbourne, was that we were in for a season defined by close battles and unpredictable swings in momentum. 4, maybe even 5 teams looked capable of fighting for race wins. McLaren were certainly in the conversation, but no one foresaw just how complete their package would prove to be. What separated McLaren early on was not only raw pace, but their ability to extend tire life in ways that gave them strategic flexibility. While rivals were locked into conventional one-stop or two-stop strategies, McLaren often found themselves with additional options, and that flexibility was repeatedly converted into results. Over time, those margins became insurmountable. The rest of the grid was not simply beaten. They were outthought, outmanaged, and outdeveloped. This season stands in stark contrast to 2024, when McLaren had to claw tooth and nail to edge out Ferrari for the title by a margin slimmer than the points earned for a single podium. That campaign was dramatic, hard-fought, and celebrated because it was unexpected. But what we have seen in 2025 has been something altogether different. From the first races, McLaren signaled their intent with back-to-back dominant performances. By mid-season, the championship fight had effectively ended. 12 wins in the opening 15 GP races turned the constructors' race into a formality. It was not just about victories either. It was the manner in which they arrived. Rivals were left scratching their heads, with drivers admitting privately that no matter how well they executed their weekends, McLaren always seemed to have the upper hand. The sheer one-sidedness of this championship evokes comparisons with the legendary seasons of McLaren in the late 80s and Red Bull's golden run of the early 2010s. That kind of dominance is rarely seen, and when it does appear, it is the product of much more than simply a fast car. Dominance in Formula One never happens by accident. It is not the product of a lucky regulation change or a single breakthrough. It is the result of leadership, vision, and a culture that pushes every department to align around one goal. McLaren's resurgence can be traced back to 2016, when Zak Brown took over as chief executive officer. At that time, the team was a shadow of its former self, languishing in 6th place in the constructors' standings and finishing the season nearly 700 points adrift of Mercedes. McLaren were drifting, struggling to rediscover an identity that had once made them the gold standard in Formula One. Zak Brown inherited that mess from Ron Dennis, the man who built McLaren into a modern powerhouse and whose perfectionist philosophy carried the team to countless victories. Succeeding a figure of that stature was always going to be daunting, and back then, few believed that under Brown's watch McLaren would climb back to the very top, let alone claim consecutive titles less than a decade later. Brown's leadership has never been about showmanship. What defined his tenure was a willingness to make difficult, sometimes unpopular decisions. He understood that Formula One is a results-driven sport, and if people or structures were not delivering, they needed to change. Over the years, that approach reshaped McLaren. It meant moving away from failed partnerships, restructuring technical departments, and empowering individuals who could bring something different. One of the biggest turning points came when Andreas Seidel departed to join the Audi project. At the time, many wondered if McLaren had lost one of the key architects of their revival. Instead, the team promoted Andrea Stella to the role of team principal. Stella, who had been quietly respected within McLaren and across the paddock, brought a different energy. His calm, methodical leadership has proven to be one of the most important ingredients in McLaren's success. Andrea Stella's approach is rooted in balance. He knows that in a two-driver team fighting at the very front, egos and rivalries can quickly spiral out of control. His philosophy has been to create a culture of shared responsibility where drivers and engineers see themselves as part of one unit rather than competing factions. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri embody that balance. Both are young, ambitious, and immensely talented. Both have championship aspirations. Yet Stella has overseen an environment where, despite inevitable flashpoints, the team-first mentality still prevails. That is not to say there is no tension. After the Singapore GP, when Norris made an aggressive move on Piastri at turn 3 on the opening lap, frustration boiled over on team radio and in post-race interviews. Piastri was visibly upset, and Norris defended his decision. McLaren called it a racing incident, but it was a reminder of how delicate the balance remains. With Piastri holding a 22-point lead over Norris in the standings and 6 races left, every wheel-to-wheel battle carries enormous weight. Stella's challenge is to maintain harmony without stifling competition, and how he handles the final rounds could define not just this season, but the trajectory of McLaren's future. Beyond driver management, McLaren's greatest strength has been how effectively they have adapted to the budget cap era. In modern Formula One, teams cannot simply spin their way to the front. Every decision about upgrades, development paths, and resources has to be carefully weighed. McLaren's approach has been remarkably disciplined. Each upgrade they introduced this year delivered tangible results. Their correlation between simulation data, wind, tunnel testing, and on-track performance has been near perfect. That level of precision is rare and highlights the depth of their technical department. The recruitment of Rob Marshall from Red Bull was another critical move. Marshall's years of experience in creating championship-winning machinery have added new layers of expertise, ensuring McLaren's development pipeline remains strong. The statistics paint a picture of complete superiority. Leaving Singapore, McLaren had amassed 650 points, exactly double that of Mercedes in second place. They have already recorded 7 1-2 finishes, a number unmatched since their iconic 1988 season, when Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost dominated. Their drivers have together stood on the podium 28 times, more than some entire teams managed in a decade. And with this championship, McLaren have now overtaken Williams to stand alone as the second most successful team in constructors' history, trailing only Ferrari. It is not just a title. It is a statement of where they belong in the grand order of the sport. Looking forward, the mission is crystal clear. McLaren now crave a driver's championship, a title they have not claimed since Lewis Hamilton's first in 2008. The machinery is there. The consistency is there. What remains is the final step, the ability to execute under the suffocating pressure of a season-long duel. Norris and Piastri are both capable and both hungry. Managing that dynamic will be one of the most fascinating storylines as we approach the closing chapters of this season. But beyond the immediate fight, the horizon of 2026 looms large. New technical regulations promise to shake the sport once again. McLaren must strike a delicate balance between capitalizing on their current supremacy and preparing for the reset. History shows that those who lead before a regulation change do not always lead afterward. The work they're doing now in the background will determine whether this era becomes a fleeting high point or the beginning of a sustained dynasty. As the celebrations in Singapore wind down, those who wear papaya know better than anyone that this is not the end of the story. Championships in Formula One are never permanent. They are earned again and again. McLaren's 2025 triumph will go down as one of the most complete campaigns in modern history, but the sport never stops. Rivals are already recalibrating, hunting for weaknesses, studying data, and plotting their fight back. For McLaren, the challenge is to stay hungry, to keep refining, and to ensure that this golden moment is not a one-off, but the foundation for more. McLaren's Constructors' title this year is more than a piece of silverware. It is proof that vision, discipline, and courage can turn a team's fortunes around. It is a story of leaders making hard choices, of engineers extracting every ounce of performance, of drivers pushing each other to new levels, and of a collective belief that they belong at the very top. This was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was the result of design, execution, and persistence. The next chapter is clear. A driver's crown is waiting, and a new regulatory era is approaching. The journey continues, and the story of McLaren in Formula One is far from finished. For those who have followed this with me, I hope you feel what I feel, that we're living through something special, something that generations of fans will look back on with admiration. Stay with me, because the best is still to come.